Hey, this is Dr. Fadri. We're going to start on section 2 of chapter 1 in your Bio 111 textbook. This section in your book is going to look at the theme of evolution, a study of biology that accounts for the unity and the diversity of life. So let's kind of talk about that diversity of life. To date, there have been approximately 1.8 million species that have been identified and named. So these are the species of living things on Earth that scientists know about and have studied before. But if you take a look at the discovery rate of new species per year, you can actually do a forward projection or analysis and kind of estimate that even though we know about 2 million species of things that live on planet Earth, there are actually around us somewhere between 10 to 100 million different types of living things on planet Earth, 10 million to over 100 million species. That means, to me, this is super cool as a scientist. This means that then, even though we already know about 2 million species on Earth, in reality, most of the stuff around us has not been studied or categorized or classified. So as a biologist, there's tons of different things to be able to look at and to study and to think about when we do our research. And as a biologist, we need to have some way to think about and to categorize and to classify these living things. And the branch of biology that does that is taxonomy. Taxonomy is the branch of biology that names and classifies species into groups of increasing breadth. And so the idea is that, we look at different living things on Earth and we try to find things that are really similar to one another. And in general, if two animals or organisms can reproduce together and create sexually viable and fertile offspring, we consider those two organisms members of the same species or specific category of life on Earth. But then you can imagine that there's different living things on Earth, so then we would have different species, and maybe some species would be more similar or different to one another. And so we can then think about groupings of different species according to their similarities and differences. And that's kind of what we do when we start classifying all of the things that live here on planet Earth. Right? We start out with things that can reproduce with one another and create sexually viable and fertile offspring, and that kind of grouping or classification is known as a species. We can then classify different species together and think about how they're similar and different, and then that next bigger classification is called a genus. And then we keep doing that. We keep on putting different genera together and thinking about how they're similar and different, and that kind of grouping would be called a family. This would continue in terms of groupings and classifications to be more broad and inclusive. So from family, we would then go up the next taxonomic classification to order, to class, to phylum, to kingdom, and then finally to domain. A domain would be the most broad and most inclusive classification of the taxonomics categorization scheme that we have. If you take a look at domain, something that you have in your textbook is that even though there are 2 million species of things, nearly 2 million species of things that live here on planet Earth, that's a lot. In terms of taxonomy, we really only have three domains of things living here on planet Earth. And that's because these categories are so broad and so inclusive that we're able to put into those categories many different types of species. Okay, so as these classifications go, from specific to general, even though we can include more different types of species into these categorizations, these categorizations then have to be more broad and inclusive in order to include more and more of these different types of species. So we have 2 million of these different types of species. We have 3 different domains. And really, because these domains are so inclusive, there's really one broad categorization tool that we use to figure out what domain a living thing is in or classified into. And that classification system is really the structure of the cell. So if you take a look at this figure, I know I showed this earlier in section 1, this figure has two different types of cells. A prokaryotic cell, which is small and simple and on the top right-hand corner of your screen, and a eukaryotic cell, which is large and complex and compartmentalized, which takes up the majority of the center of your screen. Now, depending on whether or not a living thing cell is made up of either prokaryotic cells, if it's a unicellular prokaryotic organism, or if that living thing is multicellular and is made up of eukaryotic cells, pretty much this distinction between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells is going to help us determine which of those three domains that living thing is classified into. So, for example, if I have a eukaryote, if I'm made of eukaryotic cells, if an organism is made of eukaryotic cells, that organism is going to be classified into the Eukarya kingdom. If, on the other hand, an organism is made up of prokaryotic cells, or if it is a prokaryotic cell, then that organism is going to belong to one of the two prokaryotic kingdoms, either bacteria or archaea. And really, again, in terms of classifying things into one of those three domains, then we would take a look at is going to be the structure of the cell. Bacteria and archaea have prokaryotic cells in their structure, and eukaryotic things in the eukarya domain, they will have eukaryotic cells. Okay. And again, these three domains of life, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, these are going to be prokaryotic, these are going to be eukaryotic, and these domains are the most inclusive categorizations of life on planet Earth. Examples of these domains would be these unicellular organisms for the domain of bacteria and archaea. And for the domain of eukarya, these will tend to consist of either multicellular organisms in the kingdoms of plants, fungi, or animals, or in the case of single cellular eukaryotic organisms, they would be protists. Okay, so that kind of is a really broad way of thinking about all of the different things that live here on planet Earth. They are lumped into three domains, bacteria, archaea, or eukarya, and they're classified by this taxonomic classification system, where even though we have three domains, we have about 2 million known and identified species. So that accounts for the diversity of life. On the other end of the spectrum, everything that's alive has some really interesting things in common. Okay, first of all, the thing that they all have in common is that the genetic language, or the instructions for living things, is all encoded in the molecular language of DNA, right, or deoxyribonucleic acid. So DNA is the universal genetic language common to all organisms, which is kind of amazing, because if there's 2 million different species on planet Earth, what's to say that the instructions for those living things would be all the same type of molecule? Why is it all DNA? Why isn't it DNA for some organisms, proteins for other organisms, carbohydrates for others? Even though there's 2 million different species, yet somehow all of those species, their genetic programming is based on deoxyribonucleic acid. So that's pretty interesting. The second thing that's really interesting that unites all of the diversity of life is that all living things are made of cells. And all cells, whether or not they're prokaryotic or eukaryotic, they're going to have 4 things in common. They're going to have a plasma membrane, or a barrier, on the outside of that cell. They're going to have a cytoplasm, which is going to be like the molecular soup that serves as like the inside of the cell. And they're going to have ribosomes that make protein, and they're going to have genetic information, that's DNA. And so again, even though there's 2 million species here on planet Earth, interestingly, they all have DNA as their genetic code, and they all have in common at least 4 different structures: the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm, genetic material of DNA, and ribosomes that make protein. So how do we explain that kind of commonality between everything that's alive? Okay. And the theory, the scientific theory that unites both the unity and the diversity of life is going to be evolution by natural selection. Okay, so you've probably heard about evolution before, and you've probably heard about the name Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is the scientist that we give credit to for coming up with the theory of evolution by natural selection. And really, what I think I want to do first is I want to explain the theory first, and then I'll talk about the example of Charles Darwin and how he kind of came up with this theory. So if you'll forgive me for a moment, I'm going to go ahead and go to the theory of natural selection. Okay. Evolution by natural selection. So let's take apart what evolution is first and look at its definition. First of all, evolution is a change in the frequency of an allele. An allele is a version of a gene, so we're talking about changes in that genetic programming that we kind of talked about earlier in a population over time. And so when we're talking about evolution, we're really talking about, I think, 4 things. First of all, change. There's going to be something that's going to be altered through this process of evolution. The second thing that's important when we're thinking about evolution is the frequency of an allele. And all that means is just the frequency of a version of a gene. In other words, if we have a gene for red hair versus a gene for black hair, if we have a version of a gene for like a brown coat color versus a version of a gene for black coat color, if we have a version of a gene that lets our muscles be good at long distance running versus having a version of a gene that allows our muscles to be good at sprinting, right? The frequencies of those different versions of those genes that allow us to have these different traits. That is one of the things that we would be looking at or be concerned with when we're thinking about evolution. The third thing that we need to think about in terms of evolution is that we are looking at a population of organisms. Now, if you think back to our levels of biology, a population is a group of individuals who are all of the same species. Okay? So when we think about evolution, we don't think about like one giraffe changing its trait over time. We don't think about one mouse changing its traits over time. We're thinking about a population. And in terms of that population, we're thinking about that group of mice or the group of giraffes or maybe the group of whales, a population, many members, many individual members of a species. And what we're thinking about is how those individual members of the species, how that population, the frequency of those traits changes over time. And of course, the last thing that we're going to be thinking about for evolution by natural selection is that time component. There has to be a change over a generation or 2 generations or maybe, in terms of longer time periods, maybe decades, maybe hundreds of years, maybe millions of years. But there is a time component to evolution when we're talking about it. So, evolution is change in the frequency of an allele or a version of a gene in a population over time. And to kind of explain this a little bit better, I wanted to give and provide a concrete example. So, say for example, there's a gene for in beetles that controls the color of the beetles, either dark beetles or light beetles. And again, the versions for a gene are called alleles. So in other words, in a beetle population, there are some dark beetles and light beetles. And these dark beetles and light beetles, they have these genes for these colors. And there's a version of the gene that leads to dark beetle color, and there's a version of a gene that leads to light beetle color. And at the beginning of our experiment, the frequencies in the population of those alleles are about 50-50. So in other words, about half of the beetles in that population have the allele or the version of the gene that gives them dark beetle color. And the other 50% of those beetles have a gene or an allele or a version of the gene that gives them a light color. Now, here's the thing, here's the part, here's the change, right, that's going to take place that's going to lead to evolution. There has to be some sort of selective pressure, okay, that unfortunately makes it the case that not all of the beetles are going to survive to the next generation. So in other words, they're not going to be able to survive long enough to reproduce. And if they don't reproduce, they're not going to be able to survive long enough to pass on that dark or light beetle color trait. Okay? When there's that kind of, in some cases, maybe it's environmental pressures. Maybe there's drought. Maybe there's flood. Maybe there's extreme temperature change. Maybe there's interactions with other things. So, for example, a selective pressure could be predation. by a bird. Maybe there's a bird that's eating different beetles, right? Whatever it is, there has to be a selective pressure or something that unfortunately makes it the case that not all of the beetles survive to pass on their alleles or their version of that gene to the next generation. So this is going to cause a change in the frequency of those alleles. Take a look. If we have the second generation or the end of our experiment, and we take a look at that beetle population, again, not one beetle, but all of the beetles kind of in that space and all belonging to the same species. In that population, there may still be two alleles. There still may be dark beetles and light beetles. But because of that selective pressure, because of the predation by the bird, right, the fraction or the frequency of beetles with the dark color becomes 75%. And then the fraction or the frequency of the beetles that have the allele for light color now become 25%. Okay? So if you compare the beginning of the experiment to the end of the experiment, there has been a change in the fraction of the population that has either dark beetle color alleles or that has light beetle color alleles. Okay? And so when we think about evolution, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for four things. A change, right? That would be 50-50 to 75-25 in the frequency of an allele, right? How many beetles have dark color? How many beetles have the allele for light color? 50-50 in the beginning, and it becomes 75-25 at the end. In a population, our population are beetles, right? And then over time, we're looking at one generation to the next. So this is kind of a step-by-step example of evolution by natural selection. Now, this is going to correspond to the figures that come next in your PowerPoint. So take a look. This is our beetle population. It's hanging out. There's that dark and light beetle population with the different alleles and the variation. Here comes the selective pressure. There is a bird, and it is hungry, and it is looking for beetles to eat. And then there's dark soil hanging out, right? And the beetles are hanging out in this dark soil. And, right, the dark beetles are camouflaged against the dark soil. The light beetles, unfortunately, because they're lighter, they contrast more against the dark soil, and the bird can see them better. So the bird is eating and picking off, right, those light color beetles because they're easier to see, and so they're easier to hunt, and they're easier to eat. And unfortunately, that means those light color beetles have less chance of survival, so they have less chance at reproducing. But the dark color beetles, right, they're camouflaged, they're hiding from the bird, they're able to reproduce, which means in the next generation, right, instead of being 50% dark and 50% light, take a look at this. Now, the percentage of the beetles in the population that are dark has increased because they were able to hide and be camouflaged and not be seen by the birds. So they're able to have little beetle babies, and the beetle babies grew up and became beetle adults in the next generation. And the frequency of the light color beetle allele, right, decreased because, well, they got eaten. They weren't able to survive. They didn't have little beetle babies, and the beetle babies didn't persist into the next generation. And so the frequency of that lighter color beetle goes down. This is a pretty good example of evolution by natural selection, and I like to use this example as a way of pointing out the requirements for evolution by natural selection. This is going to be a key thing for the test, so kind of star this and think about this because you'll definitely see this as a multiple choice question on the test. First of all, you need variation in a trait, okay? There has to be different traits in a population, light beetle color versus dark beetle color, right? Because there has to be a change in the frequency of those traits in a population over time. So there has to be variation in a trait. That's number one, right? Second is that there has to be some sort of selective pressure, right? If all of the beetles were able to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation, those frequencies of those alleles would remain the same. Selective pressure, unfortunately, right, means that not all of the beetles are going to be able to reproduce. So only a portion of them are going to be able to pass on their genes to the next generation. And that selective pressure then means that, only part of those beetles will be able to be successful in terms of survival or reproduction. Okay, so that selective pressure increases survival or reproduction for only part of that population. Only part. It's selective, right? And then last is heritability of that trait. Okay, so whatever trait allows for higher survival or reproduction in that population, well, it has to be heritable, so that when those survivors reproduce, that heritable trait gets passed down from one generation to the next. Now, if you have these three things, variation in a trait, selective pressure, and heritability of that trait, right, then that mechanism of evolution by natural selection, that process by which traits that are advantageous to survival or reproduction get passed down from one generation to the next, that process of evolution by natural selection can occur. Okay. In your book, you're going to see the other example of evolution by natural selection of finches. Okay, and your evolution interactive quiz has an kind of a video and a quiz and an explanation of finches on the Galapagos Islands that kind of looks at the diversity of finch beaks on the islands and evolution and how possibly finch beak diversity arose. This is going to be the case or the situation that Charles Darwin observed in order to give him the idea of evolution by natural selection. So if you could please, when you're done with this particular video lecture, take a look at your evolution interactive video quiz, answer the questions, and turn in the evolution video quiz link, PDF to the evolution video quiz link. If you have any questions about this particular theme of biology, shoot me an email. mfadri@waketech.edu. I thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the next section. Thanks.